With forests, waterways, grasslands, and even coffee under assault, the United Nations launches a global effort to reverse the decline of nature. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's called ecosystem restoration, an urgent call to action by the United Nations to tackle the triple threat of climate change, loss of nature, and pollution over the next decade. The challenge is to restore at least 1 billion hectares of land, an area about the size of China, and reverse the alarming trend of degradation. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Michael Dorsey is an environmental scientist, advocate, scholar, and entrepreneur. Changhua serves as Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. Also with us is Kevin Njabo. He is a conservation biologist and the Africa Director and Associate Professor at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And Sweta Chakraborty is a risk and behavioral scientist and the President of the US operations for We Don't Have Time. That's the social network that launched environmental activist Greta Thunberg. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Sweta, let me start with you. The theme of this year's World Environment Day is ecosystem restoration. That sounds big, it sounds ambitious. So put it into perspective for us. What's broken and how do we fix it? How do we restore it, so to speak?
Well, unfortunately, ecologists will say that we are in the 6th mass extinction as we speak. We are looking at 1 million species going extinct by 2040, majority of that is in the oceans, and we are part of a very interconnected, complex water and land ecosystem that we really need to protect and preserve and recover in order for us to have any semblance of a future that is healthy and thriving. And so this is why today's focus and theme is so important, and it's really pertinent to remember that we need to get to biodiversity recovery by 2050. So we are still very much on a path towards extinction and endangerment of species. We need to turn that around in the next 30 years and move to the recovery phase. So that will keep us on target and a trajectory that will prevent much more worst case scenarios of climate change by the end of this century. So this is a real target for us that we're emphasizing today with this focus on biodiversity and ecosystem restoration.
So Sweta, it seems a lot of damage has already been done. Is this coming at the right time right now? Should it have started a lot earlier?
Absolutely. This is something that unfortunately we are talking about more and more because we're living it. But the sirens were sent out decades ago once it was actually became clear that we were systematically degrading soil and messing up habitats through deforestation and encroachment, and all of these things combined has resulted in what we're experiencing now, which is increased frequency and intensity of climate change impacts, which unfortunately is a vicious cycle. So as we continue to warm the planet, we're going to see more frequent impacts, which is going to result in more degradation of our ecosystem. So we should have started sooner, but better late than never.
Michael Dorsey, the United Nations says that humans are using about 1.6 times the amount of services that nature can sustain. I mean, we are seeing forests being cleared, we are seeing oceans being degraded, rivers and lakes being polluted, wetlands are being drained at the same time. How does one fix that, and at what cost?
Well, look, there is a tremendous amount of ecosystem plunder going on around the world. You're absolutely correct. It's something that we've got to get out ahead of, and we've got to do that really quickly. The fact is that for a very small amount of money, we can get huge returns. You know, simply investing in about 10%, 10 to 15% of ecosystems strategically done can see upwards of 2/3 of species protected worldwide. We know that we've got great returns in terms of every dollar that we put in for ecosystem restoration, we see north of $30 in returns. So you got a 3,000% return. Try to get that out of your checking account today. Nothing like that. Nothing like those returns are coming to you. So for a little bit of money, we can get huge returns if we do that strategically, if we do that prudently, and we do that really quickly.
Michael, you refer to it as plunder, and there seems to be, the big challenge seems to be the way things are looked at, the perception, because a lot of the plunder that's taking place because people believe that they can have better lives. If you plunder forests, if you plunder the ocean, etc., it's quick profits. It's very short-sighted, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, and I would say it's not just individuals per se, it's certainly institutions. We've got some, I'll call it policy schizophrenia, even in the White House in the United States. Last week they were granting permits for, extraction in the Alaskan Arctic ecosystems, and this week they're offering to protect those very same ecosystems. So we've got to be really prudent. We've got to get away from doing, compromises, particularly with protecting ecosystems, and we've got to do that in a way that's really, really fast, and it really pays attention to, getting those big returns that we can do if we are not engaged in that plunder.
Kevin and Njabo, forests provide the habitat for 80% of the world's birds, mammals, and amphibians. But we can see right now what's happening. Forests are being cleared at an alarming rate, and what's left is being destroyed by wildfires. This is what the UN's Forestry Division had to say. Let's listen.
In the last 30 years, we have lost an area of forest of 420 million hectares. That's the size of 2 countries, India and Nigeria combined. So we're currently still losing 10 million hectares a year. That's 2.5 times the size of Switzerland. That has to stop, and we can do that. The major reason for the deforestation varies across the world, but largely it's because of agricultural expansion.
So, Kevin, the African Union has launched the Great Green Wall, and that is something that will take place in 11 countries. It was launched in 2007, actually. The overall goal, of course, is to vegetate 150 million hectares. What can you tell us about this effort and the science behind it?
Thank you very much. When I look at that, I just think it is singing to the choir. And I always put it in a different perspective. Like, I'll ask you a simple question. How much do you think it will cost, the COVID-19 will cost the world? If you just have to put it in numbers, how much will COVID-19 really cost the world? And if you look at what we've been doing for the past couple of years, we've seen that the failure of tropical forest to protect them has cost us trillions of dollars. And when we look at most of the reports that we've been doing and the type of perspectives which we look going forward, we know that just to avoid or to reduce the transmission of spillovers, diseases from humans, from wildlife in the forest to humans, would cost about $20 to $30 billion every year. But COVID-19, by the time we finish dealing with this pandemic, it should cost us upwards of $15 trillion. So that is what we're saying, that the havoc we are creating by just ignoring most of these perspectives coming from the forest is what is really destroying the world. So we need to really change rhetoric. So the first thing I look at, it's always diversity. Who are we talking to? You look at this interview panel, we're preaching to ourselves. We're talking to the people who understand what it is. So if we don't change that rhetoric, if we think that planting one tree when the custodians of the forest cannot take care of themselves, they cannot have health care, they cannot have potable water, we're wasting our time. If we think that banning import of ivory or scales from pangolins will solve social problems, it will not. So we really need to address social injustice around the world, making sure that we make sure why are people really fighting? Why do you think young Africans are dying in the Mediterranean every day because they're flying to Europe? Why do we have these huge problems at the US-Mexico border? Why do you have huge problems in Palestine and Israel? So once you can look at those issues, then we are addressing how we can protect the forest, or else we're just preaching to the choir.
Michael Dorsey, what are your thoughts on what Kevin just told us?
Well, look, protecting ecosystems is not only key for communities, it's really key for the planet overall. If we were simply investing in protecting the critical ecosystems now, we could see upwards of a third of achievement of our mitigation efforts in terms of tackling climate change. So for just a little bit of energy, a little bit of effort, we get huge returns when we decide to protect ecosystems. So it's actually really, really key. It's key for social systems, it's key for communities, it's key for really the political economy of the entire planet.
And how important is it, Michael, for us to connect the environment to people's daily lives, to the fact that there is deep inequality in the world today, that people live in poverty in many countries, there's conflict in many parts of the world?
Well, a lot of people are already connected to the environment in many, many ways. The vast majority of the world is still, dealing and working in agriculture. They're connected to the environment in ways that we don't necessarily see in the rich countries in the global north, like here in the U.S. or in Europe. The fact is that many, many people, many communities have real relationships to nature, are involved in protecting it and so forth. So we need to actually get institutions, government institutions, agencies, entities to protect and support those communities that are already out there on the front lines protecting ecosystems and fighting to do so.
Right. Changhua, let's look at what China has been doing. China, of course, has its own Great Green Wall. Tree planting has been at the heart of China's environmental efforts. We've had millions of trees that have been planted. It's turned deserts into farmland. It's turned marshlands into farmland in China. It even protects cities like Beijing from the windstorms that we have seen in the past. But in March this year, Beijing did see very heavy sandstorms, and that's the first time that has happened in 6 years. We have a comment here from Liu Junian, who's a climate scientist with Greenpeace. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Climate change is the ultimate reason that underpinned more and more severe sandstorm took place in northern China this year. Extreme warm temperature, drought, and degradation of ecosystems all contributed to the severe sandstorms in this spring. So the ultimate solution to avoid more and more sort of increasing risks of a sandstorm is tackling climate change, not just planting trees.
So Changhua, what do you make of that? I mean, what happened and what do you think still needs to be done?
I think the extreme sandstorm that happened back in March is a good showcase in terms of how complicated complexity actually of the issues are we're talking about here. Yes, China has been investing heavily in restoring nature, and planting trees is only part of it, and then of course protecting other ecosystems, particularly around returning arable land actually back to forest, to grassland, to wetland, whatever. But in the meantime, actually, the global climate change challenge remains to, it's there. It's basically saying, look, we've been disrupted or damaged many links of the web of our life, and we are living in it. And yes, measures, efforts, actions definitely will help. But somehow there is a tremendous sense of urgency that we definitely need to accelerate and step up the efforts actually to restore nature. I think the theme of the World Environment Day this year, ecosystem restoration, probably really fits the time in terms of the sense of the urgency and also the size of the challenge we are talking about.
Sweta, the World Environment Day is being hosted this year by Pakistan. Now, this is a country which is trying to tackle its own environmental problems. It set itself the ambitious goal of planting 10 billion trees by 2023. That's not far away. Pakistan's deforestation is considered one of the highest in the world. At the same time, it also wants to get 40% of its energy from renewable sources. And it wants to do that by 2030. But this also poses the classic dilemma or challenge that developing countries face, and that is it has to balance protecting the environment, managing ecosystem restoration, and at the same time trying to meet the cost of converting to renewables. How difficult is this?
This is an incredible challenge, and this is a country, and along with its neighbor India, that is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And these pledges are all well and good, but we need to see roadmaps from not just Pakistan and India and other countries that are especially vulnerable because they're in the lower latitudes to impacts of heat and other ripple effects from climate, like lands no longer being arable and prolonged droughts, heavy precipitation. All of these impacts are disproportionately impacting some of the countries that are still being hesitant in putting forward these roadmaps. Now, it's completely understandable that this is a massive, complex challenge that requires a lot of political will, but ultimately it comes down to acting now in advance of so that these targets are met at 2030, 2040, 2050 is when India said that it would also be meeting its pledges ahead of COP26. We need to see exactly the plan for doing so. And that is something that then can be scaled to additional vulnerable countries around the world. Because again, this is not something that is that is isolated to any one nation state. Climate change does not respect any national borders. This is something that we can share ideas and scale solutions and learn from one another.
Michael, let's take a closer look at the situation here in the United States, especially in the state of Florida. We have this report here from CGTN reporter Nitza Soledad Perez. Let's take a look.
Heat has been called the silent killer of the climate crisis. A recent independent study estimated that heat contributes to an average of 5,600 U.S. deaths a year. That's 8 times higher than estimates by the Centers for Disease Control. The National Weather Service has also identified excessive heat as the country's leading weather-related killer, going back more than 15 years. The most vulnerable to extreme heat are those who live in low-income neighborhoods, often without the means to afford air conditioning, the elderly, and outdoor workers. Osmani Delgado has been doing construction work for the past 15 years.
Feels bad because it's pretty hot right now. I don't know, it's about 90-something degrees. So.
Do you feel it's getting warmer?
It's getting warmer, every other year, every year.
Miami is used to heat. It's a tropical paradise, right? Well, that's changing, and not for the better. Temperatures keep rising, and that's the reason the mayor of Miami-Dade decided to appoint the country's first ever official dedicated exclusively to heat waves.
We are expected to have close to 3 months of a heat index of 105 or more by mid-century here in Miami-Dade County.
That's 41 Celsius degrees. Gilbert is asking local and federal governments to act on this lethal threat.
So the first thing we can do is increase the number of trees we're planting in our right-of-ways, giving away trees. The county gives away trees, 2 trees per property owner every year. We need to make sure those are getting to the households that need it most. Here in Florida, we're also very at risk of hurricanes. And so there is the compounding risk of, if we have a hurricane and widespread power outages and a heat wave, then we're particularly vulnerable.
In Florida, most government efforts to address the side effects of climate change have focused on rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and protecting the tourism industry. But a more basic question is, who's going to enjoy the outdoors, the beaches, even Disney, if it's too hot to simply be outside? Nitza Soledad Perez, CGTN, Miami.
Michael, we know that global greenhouse gas emissions have been rising for 3 consecutive years. In fact, experts are telling us that we're heading for catastrophic climate change. At the same time, ecosystem restoration means that we protect, we halt, and we try and reverse what is taking place right now. But the question is there time?
We've got to do both things at the same time. You know, the last segment, I think, shone a nice light on the way in which, you know, heat stress affects communities. But the reality is that it affects those on the margins of society, those that are poor, those that are less well off, you know, much, much more. We've got great data that says that people that are in poor areas, you know, they've got less access to shade and tree cover, and as well as access to good things like, you know, pools, public pools, and so forth, to be, you know, addressing this problem. So we've got to put energy to tackle environmental racism, not so much in terms of, you know, those that are exposed to emissions, but those that lack access to good things like pools, like parks, like shade cover. These are things that we've also got to put money in. And as along the way, we've got to put money into things not just like afforestation, but we've got to take money out of financing companies and subsidies that go into doing deforestation. So we've got to do all these things at once.
Kevin, there was a report that was released by the World Wildlife Fund not so long ago, and it lists actually the animal and plant species in Africa that are threatened by rising heat and by deteriorating ecosystems. What are some of the unique challenges that Africa faces?
At this stage, what we've seen now is that most of the species that live in Africa now are at the threshold of the temperatures. So any rise in temperature will be devastating for the region. Most of them will either go extinct or learn to adapt. So it is really, really dangerous. We find ourselves in a situation where if we don't change the rhetoric, if we don't really translate most of these issues that policymakers can understand, because when we speak the language of science, at times they don't see the impact until we get hit by a pandemic, which is costing us 500 times more than would have cost us to prevent it. So we live in an era where we need to make sure we readdress most of these issues, look at how do we address what is responsible for this climate change, what is pushing the climate upwards. Why are we really destroying this only environment? Why is it that to sustain life on Earth now, we need about 4 Earths? So we just have one. So business as usual is not an option. We need to make sure we reprogram all the different things we want to do, address the issues that is facing the world, making sure issues like corruption, good governance, completely addressed. If we don't scale it back, then we're facing a devastating and a world that we are going to destroy ourselves.
Changhua, to what extent has the pandemic set back efforts to address environmental problems?
I think it depends. I think on one side, on the positive side, actually, because of the shutdown, due to the pandemic, and the human activities, economic activities, somehow just stopped, right? And we see clearly, and the recovering, actually, to a certain extent, the nature better, back to life. And then during the recovery side, actually, because of the sense of urgency, lots of money, particularly from the stimulus packages for largest economies, suddenly flowing into fossil fuels. And that's why we are experiencing rising of fossil fuels and also carbon emissions there. And that's why we're talking about here about the deterioration of climate change challenges. Why? Because we didn't really grab the opportunity and really turn the clock back and launching as a launching pad for this transition towards a climate resilient, clean energy structure, future. But other than that, I think in the meantime, the global community in the recovery process also recognizes the sense of urgency, particularly using the COP26 for climate change and COP15 for biodiversity conservation this year, using the two vehicles to reunite our global community and to address the challenges we're talking about here today.
Sweta, of course, the pandemic has also had a big impact on economies around the world. Is there a risk that as countries struggle with low growth, with high unemployment, that it will come at the cost of ecosystem restoration?
Yes, unfortunately, and that's why there's more of carrot type approaches being put forward to get investment into more ecosystem restoration and biodiversity efforts. We're seeing it through environmental and social and governance investing that isn't just including investments for science and innovation, which is great, and we need to think through how to make the energy grids more renewable around the world. But in addition to that, in addition to funding technology advancement, we also need to look very carefully at putting that money into ecosystem restoration, because there will be economic growth and prosperity through that type of investment, as my fellow panelist Michael has described. And it's something that is a win-win if it's thoughtfully considered and designed correctly.
Michael, what we are talking about here, they're existential threats. And I'm wondering to what extent one has to convince governments around the world, one has to convince big corporations around the world that these are existential threats, that they need to get on board, that they need to get their priorities right.
I think governments recognize that this threat to ecosystems is indeed an existential threat. I think the challenge is getting them to speed up the process to respond. Like I said, earlier, we've got lots of schizophrenia in the policymaking. We've got President Biden on the one hand saying that we shouldn't, drill in the Arctic ecosystems in 1 week, last week, and then this week pulling out the permits to do the same kind of drilling. So we've got to get policy coherence, and that I think is going to happen when citizen groups like Sunrise Movement, upon whose board I sit, and others, keep pressure on those elected officials to deliver what they've been, committed to and what they're promising to do. We can do this, but we got to get governments to go faster, and we also got to get companies to get out of the way. Many of them are, committed to old 20th century ideas and processes. Fossil fuel technology, fossil foolishness of the 20th century, that's no longer viable. We've got to make big investments in renewable energy, and we can do that because that now is the cheapest way to generate electricity, and those have upsides to protecting ecosystems as we go forward.
Kevin, of course, all these efforts are going to cost money, including the Great Green Wall effort. There was an announcement made by the French government, and they said that development banks and governments have pledged $14.3 billion. Are you confident that the funds will come through, and that is it going to be enough?
It's definitely not going to be enough. Like I said, if you look at, I always go back to realities. Like for policymakers, give them the numbers, engage them in debates, make sure they see what's going on, and break it down in a language that they can understand. Like we focus our attention in things that don't really matter because it is what social media drives us to. They will be fighting on, oh, the coronavirus was invented in China. And they speak that for weeks on end. So we're diverting our minds from the real issues when we know there is a history of where these pandemics are the spillover are coming from. So fighting the preventive measures will cost us just for pandemics about $20 to $30 billion every year. So that money will not be enough if we're just trying to restore completely. We need to reprioritize our priorities. Look at what does it really cost us to fight it, and what does it cost us to prevent it? Once policymakers can understand and see those real numbers, then they're going to invest more. $14 billion will not be enough.
Sweta, what about education efforts? You know, there are people like you, like Greta Thunberg, who've been doing a lot to raise awareness of the challenges that we face right now, but is enough being done?
Well, what's beautiful about that is we have tools now that we didn't have necessarily even a decade ago that we can take full advantage of and really share with each other ideas and scale solutions that we see that are working. One is We Don't Have Time. It's a social network that brings climate concerned citizens around the globe together, and we can help educate one another. And that is a peer type education that is available to us now. In addition to that, we need efforts from multilateral organizations, top down, to really ensure that those that are have least access to some of these new tools and technologies still get the information that they need. And that is happening through efforts through the UN. As we lead up to COP26, we're seeing increased efforts to ensure that all voices, even in the remote corners of the earth, are being reached out to. And so there's a lot of good progress there, but of course, we need to continue education and awareness campaigns urgently.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.